Okay, should we start then? So this is the third session on rural households. The rules, sort of as with all the other presentations so far, each speaker has 15 minutes. We'll take a discussion will follow after that, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So you're up.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Ongokame Mutobi. I'm presenting a paper titled Infrastructure Deficiency and Adoption of Mobile Money in Sub-Saharan African Countries. The paper that I'm presenting here, I'm co-authoring it with Lucas Gilsboski. And in this paper, we're trying to find out how availability of infrastructure affect the adoption of mobile phones and mobile phone services. In the past decades, sub-Saharan African countries have seen exponential growth of mobile phone services mobile phone adoption to become the second connected continent after Asia. So the deployment of mobile telecommunications actually allowed the low-income countries to overcome one of the problems or the main burdens, which are poor fiscal infrastructure and lack of internet access. However, the adoption of mobile phone and have a potential of changing the livelihoods of low-income country residents by actually giving them access to services that they could not access previously, such as mobile-based education, mobile-based health, and mobile banking services. There's some literature which has actually found out that mobile phones can actually contribute to both economic growth and to changing the livelihoods of the poor. ACA and BT identifies 3 channels in which a mobile phone can actually improve the livelihoods of people and improve economic growth. They say that a mobile phone can improve access to information and reduce such costs. And also it can improve management of supplies and also improve productive efficiency. On the other hand, they find that the adoption of mobile phone can provide services that were generally not available to low-income households, such as mobile phone-based financial, health, and educational services. Hence, in this paper, we try to analyze how the availability of physical infrastructure influences the adoption of mobile phones and the use of mobile money services. We approximate physical infrastructure by night light intensity data, which we get from the Defense Meteorological Survey, satellite data. However, there is limited literature on the adoption of mobile financial services in low-income countries. This is due to the fact of shortage of individual level data on the use of mobile banking and in low-income countries, and available data is mostly aggregate country level data, which in most cases does not fit the purpose of this due to short time spent since the availability of mobile banking. However, among the few studies that have been done in this area, Mbiti and Vale do a study in Kenya, and they find that M-Pesa increases probability of people being banked, and some study find that the use of mobile phone improve market performances and increase welfare, and some study find that mobile money drives financial inclusion. And then in this paper, we try, as I mentioned before, we're trying to analyze how the availability of physical infrastructure influences adoption of mobile phones and mobile financial services. We use 2 data sets. The first data comes from Research ICT Africa, which is an individual survey for 11 sub-Saharan African countries. And then we complement this data with Defense Meteorological Satellite Program Open Linear Scanner, night light intensity data, which enables us to analyze how special differences in infrastructure development across sub-Saharan African countries influence the adoption of mobile phone and use of mobile phone services. So this is the sample of that of our data. We have 11 countries, which is Botswana, Cameroon, and others, and then we have the full sample, which is about 13,814 individuals, and then we also, because of availability of night light intensity data, we restrict our sample also to individuals who we are able to get night light intensity data for where they reside, and our sample reduces to 9,666. And there I also show the adoption of mobile phones. We find that South Africa is one of the countries that have higher mobile phone adoption at 85%, followed by Botswana at 84%. On the restricted sample, we find Botswana to be still the same. South Africa has 86%, and followed by Botswana at 85%, and Ethiopia has lower mobile phone adoption at 36%, but it increases in the restriction sample to 45%. So this is the night light intensity data. This data shows us how the world looks like in the night. So as we can see here, developed countries are more light, they're more lit than developing countries. We can also see there on the map of Africa that when you look at South Africa, Nigeria and Ghana, you can see that they are more lit than other countries, which somehow shows that countries with high GDP or countries that have more infrastructure are more lit than others, and hence we're trying to use this the night light intensity data to proxy for availability of infrastructure. The argument that we're saying is that people who live in areas that are highly developed are more likely to be lit than to have the light intensity is likely to be higher than those who live in rural areas. So in order to use this data, we have to have coordinates from the survey. Unfortunately, we didn't. The survey did not did not collect the coordinates. But however, we have location of where people resided, and therefore we use Google Maps to get the coordinates of those locations where people the respondents stay, and then we use this to extract the light intensity from this data set. However, it therefore means that people who are in one area are more likely to have only one light intensity, which therefore means that we don't have variability in our data. But fortunately, the survey collected some data, which is whether a household have electricity, whether a household have access to postal services, and whether a household have access to, whether it also asked the respondent to state the strength of the radio reception. So these variables can actually proxy how far a particular household is from physical infrastructure, such that in case where household does not have electricity, this household is likely to be more in rural places where there are no infrastructure. And a household that does not have access to postal services is more likely to be far from infrastructure. And then a household that lives in places where radio reception and TV reception is poor, they are more likely to be. So using this using this variable and with the night light intensity gives us a chance to bring about some variability in our data set. Now, our main interest or our main variables, which are dependent variable here, are social mobile social. Mobile social here is the use of mobile phone to access internet social networks such as Facebook, WhatsApp, and Skype while using the mobile phone. And then we have mobile money. Mobile money here is the use of mobile phones to transfer money from one to the other. And then we have mobile transfer, which is the use of mobile phone to transfer money where one has a bank account and access bank account using a mobile phone. We can see some variation in our sample. For instance, we all know that Kenya is one of the countries that is highly using the M-Pesa services, and as such, we have high people adopting more mobile, M-Pesa services in Kenya, mobile money services in Kenya. But due to the proximity of countries such as Rwanda and Uganda, the mobile M-Pesa became a service that is mostly used in those countries. But however, mobile money also is being used in other countries such as Botswana and Cameroon. But we have Ethiopia there, which the adoption rate is 0 for mobile money and mobile transfer. So, as I've already mentioned, we interact the nighttime light intensity data with the radio reception, postal address, and electricity. So individuals were asked to state whether they have electricity or not, whether they have a postal address, and whether they have, and the state of the radio reception. In order to analyze whether how infrastructure affects adoption of mobile phone services and mobile phone, we use the utility maximization procedure, where we argue that for an individual to adopt a mobile phone, if an individual adopts a mobile phone, they have maximized their utility. But if not, it means they don't adopt mobile phone, their utility is at minimum. So we model utility here as a category 0-1 categorical variable, and we just used a logit model to model what the adoption process, where X here will be the household characteristics, individual characteristics, and I there is the availability of service infrastructure. On our estimation, we carry out 8 estimations. The first estimation used full sample, we work with mobile phone, mobile money, mobile transfer, and mobile social. In each of these, we carry 2 estimations. In the first estimation, we use full sample, where we do not look at night light intensity data. But what we find out here in our survey, in our results, is that mobile phones are likely to be adopted in places where physical infrastructure is available than places that does not have physical infrastructure. However, we find that we find a negative relationship between mobile money, mobile service, and mobile transfer. That is, people who live in rural areas are more likely to adopt mobile money services and mobile transfer. But we do not find any significance, we do not find any. The coefficient on the mobile social is not significant, which means there is no difference in the use of mobile social between people who live in rural areas and in urban areas. All in all, we can say on average there is high night light intensity in the group of consumers having electricity connection, postal address, and strong radio reception. These results kind of support our assumption that people who live in high light intensity areas are more likely to have access to infrastructure than those who don't live in than those who live in less lit areas. We find that availability of infrastructure approximated by night light intensity has a significant and positive impact on the adoption of mobile phones. Moreover, the availability of infrastructure has a significant and negative impact on, as I've already mentioned, on mobile money and mobile transfer. So households living in areas with poor infrastructure are less likely to adopt mobile phone, but they are more likely to adopt mobile phone services. Our results also show that females are less likely to adopt mobile phones, but they are more likely to adopt mobile money transfer and the use of mobile money and mobile transfer, but not mobile social or mobile internet. These results could somehow show that or suggest that females are more likely, especially those who, we find that females who are married, are less likely to adopt mobile phones. Once they have mobile phone, they are more likely to use it for mobile money and mobile transfer. These results could somehow show that women are more likely in, coordination of mobile finances in families than males. We also find that network. Okay, thank you.
Oh, you can finish the sentence.
Okay. We also find that network effects or network externality is a very important variable in terms of adoption of mobile phone services. That is, people who have friends that use mobile phones are more likely to adopt mobile phones than people who live with, who relate with people who do not have mobile phones. So, in a nutshell, mobile money can be considered as an alternative to physical financial infrastructure, which benefits people who live in remote areas and may be excluded from financial services. So, mobile phones somehow has a potential to help poor households to get access to services that they could not get in the past. Thank you very much.
Yes, hi. So I enjoyed reading that paper, and I just have a few sort of general comments. They're all on this slide, and so one of the main things that are being discussed in the paper is sort of this, first this decision to adopt mobile phones, to get a mobile phone, and then there's sort of a follow-up decision on how they actually want to use it. So whether they do use it for banking, or whether they do want to use it to get into contact with others using sort of social media. And in the paper, this is done separately. So it's been looked at whether people adopt mobile phones, and then it's looked at among the adopters sort of what they're using it for. And in my opinion, that's very much a sort of a joint decision. Sort of, there's a first stage you adopt, and then you decide how to use it. But maybe you do that at the time when you're adopting as well. So I think one of the things that could be done here is to actually have a joint estimation of these of the outcomes here. Then also in terms of the outcomes that are being looked at, sort of there is this category of social interaction, and then there is a category of mobile banking, and that one is divided into sort of mobile transfers and mobile money. From the paper, honestly, it wasn't entirely clear to me. Sort of, it states the questions from the questionnaire that are being used to define these variables. It wasn't entirely clear to me how to draw the distinguishment. So I think this could be worked out a little bit more to distinguish between transfers and sort of mobile transfers and mobile money. And here I also want to mention there's sort of technological difficulties. One's involved sort of with the network. So some networks are probably not equipped to actually go online, to actually interact on Facebook and things like Facebook. Perhaps some money transferring apps can be run via SMS, but maybe some can't, and actually require sort of to be properly online. And I think you actually showed this in Ethiopia, where nobody uses these services to transfer money or for mobile money. And so I think perhaps controlling for what's technological feasible in the context would be a nice addition. And similarly, sort of the nighttime light data, it's being used as a proxy for economic activity. It's being used as a proxy for infrastructure. And it's being used for a lot of things. And you mentioned some of the variables it correlates with. However, I think one of the traps there is sort of that it's not entirely clear really what it means. And so I think one way would be to be very, very explicit about what you think that nighttime light data actually proxies for and what it stands for in your paper. And then sort of I have the next two comments sort of are very related, and one is that you control for a bunch of individual characteristics of the users of the mobile phone. What you're not so much controlling for is sort of the market conditions. And some of these, at least not what I saw in the paper or from the table, things like even dummy variables sort of for countries, or something that could proxy for the market conditions in which these individuals use their phones, which might help. So there's also a few things that I personally would have liked to see on robustness. For example, this is a logic specification that you're using and that you're showing, and perhaps this could be sort of you could show like how this is robust to sort of different specifications and whether this holds in an OLS setting as well. Finally, I'm not going to say too much about that, but at the end, sort of you drew policy, or you show the policy relevance. However, it wasn't entirely clear, but I do realize that the paper might not be in its final version yet, so there I would have liked to see more. Now I want to open up to the audience. Are any questions?
Thank you for the nice presentation. I was wondering, it's very interesting results and also quite in the direction that one would expect, but I was wondering whether you have done a country-specific, so whether you have done the regressions per country to see whether there is heterogeneity among the different countries, because some of them are like really different. Like Kenya is like really different in terms of like the mobile technology adoption with the M-Pesa, and South Africa is very different, I guess, in terms of development, but also the other countries are quite different. So it would be interesting if you could comment what type of heterogeneities you observe in the data.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting presentation. Just a couple of points on the night lights data. I've worked with it a little bit as well, and there are a few issues that you might want to just be aware of when working with it. One of them is this issue about top coding, which just means that the largest value in the nighttime light observation doesn't go above a number like 60. So it's just worth thinking about that. And the other thing is, how are you kind of accounting for spatial correlations in your errors when you're running your regressions? So the fact that a household, if one household is close to another household, and they both happen to be in highly lit areas, how are you accounting for the correlation in the errors? Just those two questions.
One you can Whether there's more.
And let me say, and because this paper, I think we have submitted it for publication somewhere, but I think we are still working on it, and one of the things that we are working on it is to control for market conditions. But we're thinking of using kind of fixed effects to capture for that, location fixed effects to capture for differences in countries, and then the control for technology. I didn't get that exact, but I think I will talk afterwards of what do you mean by this. But I'm thinking probably you're saying if, for instance, some use of apps need internet while some don't use. Some phone use, can access, smartphones can access internet and some phones cannot access internet. And then probably maybe it's difficult to control for that because unless if the survey, we can find in the survey that they ask people which kind of phone they use, then it will be easier to control for that. Country specification and indigeneity issues. I think that mostly would be captured by, if I understand the question well, it will be captured by issues that, using fixed effects, but indigeneity issues here, I don't get that, but I think I can talk to someone who's asking a question afterwards. And then correlation in errors due to, yes, this is one I think I have to look into. Yes, of course, like you said, the night light intensity, it all comes from 0 to 63. So it's kind of, that's what we have. And yes, yeah. So it's something that we also have to make clear in the paper. Thank you very much.
Right on time, so second presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Nugus Abadi from Ethiopia. The title that I'm going to present is on the potential uptake determinants of climate smart agriculture to supply carbon offsets in drier agroecological zones of Ethiopia. This is a work done by myself and my colleague Dr. Girmay in the same university. Okay, this is the presentation, the outline of my presentation. For the sake of time, I would like to jump into the motivation and research questions for the study. As you know, the world population is expected to grow from 7.3 million in 2030 up to 9.7 million by 2050. To feed this growing population, agricultural production has to be increased by 20%. And yet, the agricultural sector is the most vulnerable sector due to climate change, due to low adaptive capacity and reliance on rainfall. At the same time, the sector is also the major emitter of greenhouse gas, which is the source of climate change that we are facing now. For example, close to 14% of this global greenhouse gas emissions originates from agriculture. And if we include agriculture-led deforestation, this emission from agriculture also goes up to 25% of this greenhouse gas emission. Moreover, out of this total greenhouse gas emission that originates from Africa, up to 74% of this emission comes from agriculture sector of these low and middle income countries such as Ethiopia. However, the sector has also the capacity to abate climate change by enhancing soil carbon via climate smart agricultural practices. For example, 24 up to 28% of this agricultural emission can be offset by using agricultural smart agricultural practices that decreases soil disturbance and so on. Accordingly, this conservation agriculture, or sometimes climate smart agriculture, has been advocated by the global community as a means to achieve a triple win of resilience or adoption, mitigation of climate change, and achieving national food and nutritional security. In line with this international call for this climate smart agriculture, and in order to attract climate financing, the Ethiopian government also tries to adopt this climate smart agricultural practice in its green growth or climate resilient green economy strategy. For example, the Ethiopian government is envisaging to reduce carbon emissions from agriculture by 40 metric tons by 2030. However, implementation of changing farming practice so as for carbon would be a cost to smallholder farmers, while the benefit generally accrues to wider public. In this regard, compensation would be needed for smallholder farmers so that they can change their farming practice so as to mitigate this climate change. However, despite there is an interest to mitigate climate through these climate smart agricultural practices, there was no any systematic study that deals with the cost of changing farming practice by smallholder farmers. This study is therefore, based on this background, tries to answer these basic research questions. The first one is, do smallholder farmers in Ethiopia willing to accept climate smart agricultural practice, particularly zero tillage and minimum tillage? If yes, how much is the subsidy or the compensation that they need in order to accept specific agricultural, climate smart agricultural practice? And again, we try also to ask what are the factors that influence the willingness to accept and the intensity of compensation for households willing to adopt this compensation. So answering these research questions would give guidance on the cost of mitigating climate change through these agricultural or smart practices. For those of you who are not familiar with the climate smart agriculture, this climate smart agriculture, particularly the conservation tillage that we are dealing, is a package of farming practice promoted as a means to adopt and mitigate climate change, as well as an increased food security through minimum soil disturbance that restores soil carbon and continuous soil cover to conserve moisture. These first two pictures show this climate smart agriculture practice, while the lower, where there is oxen, shows the conventional agricultural system that most farmers in Ethiopia are currently using. So the issue now is how much is the compensation needed in order to change this conventional agricultural practice into this climate smart agricultural practice. And again now, what is the relevance of this climate smart agriculture practice to the study area? The study area is the region which is the northern part of Ethiopia, where 85 or 80.5% of the population resides in rural area with agriculture as a primary livelihood strategy. And this region is also relatively dry and subject to frequent drought, with an average annual rainfall ranges between 500 up to 900 millimeter per year. And again, taking into consideration the mean annual rainfall, temperature, and evaporation, the region is more than 90% of the region is considered as a semi-arid region. And poor soil quality and moisture stress are also the two major constraints of agricultural productivity in the region. Given this reality, conservation agriculture or climate-smart agriculture practice that conserve moisture and that minimize soil disturbance could be a way to enhance agricultural productivity and mitigate climate change that we are facing. So, in order to analyze the cost of changing farming practice from this conventional tillage into climate-smart agricultural practice, we try to use this method. First, determining incentives is not straightforward for many reasons. The first reason is there is uncertainty about the costs of conservation farming and the actual yields in conservation farming versus the conventional farming to date. And again, some returns in terms of yield increase from this conservation farming accrue in distant future, like 5 up to 10 years, causing disruptions in income flow that could increase incentive demanded by smallholder farmers. Landowners may have also varying preferences towards conventional versus this conservation farming or climate-smart farming. Non-market values and risk attributes also affect a significant role in farming decision whether to use this climate-smart agriculture or not. So in order to address these issues, we try to use the contingent valuation method using 330 randomly selected farmers from 3 districts in the region. Farmers were presented with a hypothetical climate-smart agriculture program that aims climate change mitigation and achieving food security through promotion of zero tillage and minimum tillage, while also compensating for the loss of agricultural production at the initial stage. They were also informed that the program would give training and equipment using specific farming practice to ensure that they enter into a 5-year commitment to adopt a particular tillage system. Following that, there was a question whether the farmers would consider enrolling in the program and an open-ended question about the minimum compensation per tillage of land, which is 0.5% hectare of land as annual payment to adopt a specific tillage practice. Finally, they were also closed with follow-up question for the farmers who responded not willing by asking why they did not do, in order to know why people are not willing to adopt this specific conservation agriculture practice. Moreover, our survey also connected some information in addition to this contingent valuation survey, such as socio-demographic variables, factor endowments such as land asset, etc., access to institutional services that influence adoption of technology based on the available literature on technology adoption. Okay. Finally, we use multivariate economic model to investigate the factors that affect this willingness to accept and its intensity. This is the model where we use the Heckman selection model. In the first stage, we try to investigate a probability model to know the probability of accepting any specific tillage. And in the second stage, once we calculate the inverse ratio, the inverse ratio into the compensation, showing in this, where I is the compensation needed per tillage of land, while X is the factor of variables that could affect adoption. And one is whether households are willing to adopt or not. So the key finding of our research is, out of these total households, 53% of the households are willing to accept minimum tillage, while the remaining 47% are not willing. At the same time, 44% of the households are willing to accept this zero tillage, while the remaining majority, or the 56%, were not interested to join in the program. While the mean annual minimum compensation per tillage of land for adoption of minimum tillage was 2,400 Ethiopian or 117 US dollar, while it is 183 US dollar for zero tillage. However, if you compare this minimum compensation required by smallholder farmers in the region with that of experiences or the cost of maintenance of this zero tillage and minimum tillage in Ghana and Morocco, the Ethiopian case is very high. For example, according to McCarthy 2011, the cost of maintenance for zero tillage in Ghana and Morocco was $220 and $220 per year, which is very less than that of Ethiopia. While the same cost of maintenance for zero tillage is between 600 and 400 respectively. This is again less than what the Ethiopian farmers are need. So again, if we see also the determinant factors for the acceptance of this minimum tillage, age of households, distance to market, land size, and livestock ownership, and the other factors such as number of hired labor were affecting adoption of minimum tillage and at the same time the intensity of compensation for a minimum tillage. The same result is also seen with regard to the probability of accepting zero tillage and the intensity of compensation to adopt zero tillage. So, for those farmers who are not interested to join this program, we were trying to ask them the reason why they are not willing, and these are the major factors that the factors mentioned not to adopt. So the conclusion is, while incentives offer influence willingness of landowners to adopt conservation agriculture, it's clearly not the sole driver of adoption decision, because there are factors such as socio-demographic factors such as age, awareness of climate change, education that affects positively, while factor endowments such as land, wealth, and labor shortage also affects positively, while livestock ownership affects negatively to willingness to accept for conservation tillage practice. This is, especially livestock ownership, is contrary to the literature on adoption of agricultural technology, because most of livestock owners adopt or affect positively agricultural technology adoption, while it affects negatively in the case of minimum tillage and zero tillage. The cost of conservation farming is also higher in Ethiopia than similar developed countries such as Ghana and Morocco. And again, livestock ownership, one of the constraints for willingness to accept this conservation agricultural practice, which complicates residue retention on the field as it's valued for fodder, given the mixed farming system that we have in Ethiopia. The result also shows that there is lack of synergies between government policies and strategies with the extension system on the ground. Because despite the government in its climate resilient strategy tries to embrace this climate smart agriculture, the extension system on the ground promotes intensive tillage rather than the conservation agriculture or the conserving tillage, which is one of the tools to mitigate climate change and increase food security. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed reading your paper, and let me start by acknowledging my limited knowledge on this subject, but I've really enjoyed and I learned a lot. I'm someone from competition and regulation, but anyway, we are economists, we deal with these things. So, the paper conduct a contingent valuation survey of smaller farmers in highlands in Ethiopia to investigate landowner preference and willingness to accept. So the paper found that willingness to accept conservation tillage to be negatively related to ownership and positively related to age, education of households, head, awareness of climate change, and such. And then they also find suggest that the unique. So So the paper suggests that the unique needs of mixed crop livestock farming system hinder further diffusion of conservation tillage, and future policy should consider addressing the needs of Ethiopian farmers, particularly crop heavily engaged in life activities. However, I do have some comments. The paper does not clearly explain the sampling strategy in terms of representativeness of the sample they considered. And then in your discussion, you discussed that farmers were told that if they state a smaller amount of compensation, then they are likely to be picked up and they are likely to be chosen to participate in the program than if they put a higher amount. But now, given that this paper is more based on a simple random sampling procedure, does this not affect that randomization strategy? And then the paper uses random utilities specification rather than, I'm wondering why did you choose a random utility specification rather than just a logit model or probit model that we normally use? My argument is, which variables do you think affect decision of individuals to participate or not to participate in a random way? Yeah, that's my most concern with the paper. Thank you.
Thanks for the interesting paper. It seems like the story you're telling is a technology that's not responding to the needs of farmers. And it seems that perhaps the livestock agriculture that's going on currently that is supposedly not climate smart is perhaps also in some ways climate smart. And I guess I'm wondering if you can kind of comment on the viability of the current system, which it seems like the farmers are strongly preferring to this potentially supposedly better system, but that doesn't seem to pay well for them.
Can I? Thanks again for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering how much your results may depend on the framing of the program, of the hypothetical program that was proposed to the farmers. And I mean, you mentioned that there were a few components about training and like 5-year commitment. How much do you think that might have, maybe confounded your results or something like that?
Yazra, please, before starting reaction. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for the great presentation. The question that I have relates to what she asked, kind of. I wanted to know, I know there was a training and farmers were explaining why the practices they were applying were not good for the environment. And I wanted to know if in your data you have a good sense how much these farmers do about like the unsustainability of these practices and the default, if nothing is done, what can happen?
Okay, shall I react? Okay, first I will try with regard to the issue raised on the sampling strategy and how these samples are representative. We tried to focus on few districts given the budget that we had, and then we tried also to consider random selection. Households were selected randomly in areas where this government tries to make a pilot intervention in terms of this climate smart agriculture. So in this regard, we feel that the samples that we select are representative, at least in the district, because the district is moisture stress district that the government was to intervene in that, and based on that, we tried to have some representatives before the government tries to implement on it. Again, in the issue of the smaller the compensation, the higher would be, because in this contingent valuation system, there is a strategic bias. For example, if farmers consider that they would get the amount that they are asked, they would ask for more, so that things would be biased. So in order to make restriction or avoid this strategic bias by respondents, we try to make as if based on bid competitive purpose. The lower the compensation households needed, the more the chances to get, because we tell them that every household is not eligible, that there is few budget for that, so that we can come up with an indicative compensation based on the opportunity cost that they are going to lose. That's the reason why. Otherwise, it's kind of random. It doesn't show that it's non-random. With regard to the issue of utility, because our intention is not only about the probability of accepting or the factors that accept, we were also trying to see the intensity, what behavior of the farmers leads to more compensation. For example, households with more livestock have higher probability of getting or asking more compensation, because in Ethiopia, the tradition is we have a mixed farming system where farmers have crop production as well as livestock production. If we introduce this minimum tillage, for example, farmers were expected to put some of their grass on the land. Unless they have alternative feed for their livestock, it's not a choice for them. So they need to have more compensation in order to forego some crop receipts in farm. So that's our intention is not only on the probability of accepting that, but also on the intensity of compensation. Who are asking more compensation? Or what is the behavior, so that we can take a lesson from these households into decision making. In addition, how much is the program realistic? To your surprise, farmers in Ethiopia are familiar with this technology from previous years, but they believe that this, especially minimum tillage and zero tillage, decreases yield. So they consider as if this kind of technology as a woman technology, because women have no labor to plow their land. Women have no assets such as oxen to plow their agricultural land. So they depend on this kind of technology and get low yield and trapped into poverty. Those people who have enough power, enough land, are not choosing this technology because they believe that it has a yield decreasing effect, like the lab experiment shows also. Lab experiment about this technology shows that this kind of technology can decrease yield up to 5 years. So farmers are very well aware of that. So given their awareness, we try to explain that. We try to explain this reality on the top of their knowledge. We try to tell them that it would decrease yield up to 5-10 years. We try to tell them that it also benefits in mitigating climate change, or it also increases yield after that, and so on. Based on that, we try to explain that some NGO or government authorities would like to compensate for the yield loss at the initial stage and for some opportunity costs. So based on that, we asked them whether they are willing to accept to join that program or not. That's how we did. Thank you very much. I don't know if any.
Any other questions?
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for having me here. Today I'm gonna talk to you about my paper on how prices of agricultural commodities affect the demand of farmers for titled land. To do so, I'm gonna focus on Uganda, on the period from 2005 to 2011, and I'm going to focus on the share of titled land in small farmers' total land holding. My identification strategy will exploit variation in international prices, and to do so, I will focus on an index of international prices that weighs the price of each agricultural commodity by the structure of local production, the agricultural production at the level of the sub-county where each household resides. My main result, if you have to rush away, is that higher prices induce farmers to increase their share of titled land, and this is due both to a higher income, so an income effect, but also to an increase in perceived insecurity. And this also is going to be shaped by the extent of social capital in the communities where my farmers reside. So what I think the contribution of my paper is that first of all, I'm going to provide a formal test of the relationship between agricultural prices and the decision of farmers to acquire titled land, whereas most of the literature at the moment addresses this link mostly through historical narrative accounts and just correlation, and especially the existing literature focuses on major systemic shocks and changes in the system of property rights, whereas what I'm going to do is focusing on the existing institutional framework and just seeing how market forces affect the decision of farmers to have titled land. Moreover, as I have already mentioned, I'm going to focus on income and incentive effects and see how they interact, and especially I'm going to establish a strong role for local social capital. So to jump straight into the presentation, in Uganda there are various types of land certificates that could be held by farmers. In decreasing orders of formality, we have what I'm going to call in this presentation formal property rights. So for those of you who are familiar with the Ugandan context, this includes freehold, leasehold, and Melo. I'm not going to go into the details of how these three major types of land certificate differ, but think of it as we might conceive property rights in an industrialized setting. So basically these are certificates that give the owner the possibility to do with the land as much as they please, provided this is in line with the Ugandan law. Then there are certificates of customary ownership. So in Uganda, most of the land is held under customary tenure, which is basically shaped by cultural and traditional norms and is administered especially at the clan level and with a particular role for chiefs of clans. But nonetheless, it is possible to acquire certificates stating the right of the farmer or of a group of farmers to hold the land under a certificate of customary ownership. Finally, I'm going to focus on certificates of occupancy, which are certificates that can be acquired by bona fide tenants on the land they are farming on behalf of someone else. These are basically titles that give still some substantial degrees of freedom to farmers to take some decisions on the land in terms of investment and production and even transmission of land up to a certain point. Despite the presence of this formal system of property rights, actually de facto only 15 to 20% of the land is registered in the country, and a few explanations have been proposed by the literature, ranging from inadequate advertising of the existence of this right, to land conflict, to especially corruption of land authorities, and lengthy and expensive processes for titling the land. In any case, given that the framework is the one I'm describing, what I'm going to focus in my paper is the share of total household land holdings under either certificates of property rights, certificates of customary ownership, and certificate of occupancy. And then as a residual category, the share of household land that is uncertified, by which I mean either land that is used under short-term rental agreements or licenses, or actually after squatting. Why I'm going to focus on share of land rather than the specific tenure of each plot of land is going to be clear when I come to my data, but that's basically because in my data I can follow households over time, but I cannot track land. So that's why I have to focus on the household level rather than actually at the specific parcel of land level. So as I was mentioning in my introduction, the identification comes from an index of international prices, whereby I am weighting the price of each agricultural commodity by the fixed share of land that is harvested with that crop in each sub-county of Uganda. When I say it's fixed, I mean that it's fixed in a period that is prior to the sample period of my analysis. My claim is that this index is both exogenous, because first of all I am considering war prices, and second because I'm using fixed land shares, and second that it is weakly relevant as a reduced form instrument for farm gate prices faced by farmers on local markets. We can discuss later in the discussion whether actually there is an adequate degree of pass-through of international to local prices. I'm not going to focus on this at the moment, but I do provide qualitative evidence that this might actually be the case. The regression equation that I'm running is linear, and I'm focusing on a household level outcomes, which are the shares that I was mentioning before, and I'm regressing that on the log of the leg of the price index, a bunch of covariates, here fixed effects, and then household level covariates, which is this eta term here, although both household level covariates and household fixed effects do not affect my results. Standard errors are clustered at the sub-county level, given that this is the level of variation of my main indicator of interest. Where is it? There, the price. The data that I'm using come from official sources. So the household data come from the Uganda Household Survey, which can be then joined to the LSMS study of the World Bank. As I was mentioning before, I'm considering the years 2005, 9, 10, and 11. The price data come from the IMF International Financial Statistics database, and for a few agricultural commodities also from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Whereas sub-county level land use comes from the GAZE project of the Food and Agriculture Organization from the year 2000. So actually I haven't shown you, but let me just quickly show to you how this looks. So basically, this is Uganda. Each polygon is a sub-county of the country, and the higher intensity of color means that a higher share of the land is devoted to production of each commodity. And I have a sample of 13 commodities that I'm using in my index. However, these data come from the GAZE project of the Food and Agriculture Organization. And then I'm going to focus on a 10% sample of the Ugandan household census for what regards ethnic composition. To jump to my results, the punchline of the paper is that higher prices induce a reduction in the share of untitled land. And if we want to disaggregate it a little bit further, this comes specifically from an increase in the share of land under formal property rights and under certificates of occupancy. So to just give you an idea of how to interpret these results, remembering that I'm considering the log of the price index, it means that an increase in the price index by 10% increases, for example, here the share of land under formal property rights by roughly 5% of the outcome mean. Admittedly, this is not a huge effect, but it is very robust. I am very happy to discuss about all the bunch of robustness checks that I'm running in the paper. I don't have time to discuss them now, but I really run a few, and if anything, I'm presenting here among the most conservative estimates that I produce. To account for these results, I provide in the paper a chain of possible mechanisms that stem from the acquisition of titled land by Ugandan farmers. And again, I'm not going to go through the formal discussion, but just to give you a flavor of what I'm doing, I am considering that as everything, like the titled land consumed by farmers depends on both supply and demand. Why I'm calling this availability will become clear in a second. Just focusing first of all on demand, I posit that there is, well, that it both derives from income and on incentives, which I'm calling willingness to pay here. And then, in turn, the incentives of farmers are shaped by both the value of land that they hold and the insecurity they feel on that land. And by insecurity, I mean the fear that somebody might contest their their ability to farm their land, and that somebody might just grab their land and squat on it. On the availability and supply side, I'm going to abstract from the formal availability of land or of land title as such, but I'm going to posit that actually the social context where farmers operate shapes the capability in an Amartya Sen, if you wish, way of farmers to be able to harvest their land. And this is going to stem from both the social position of the farmer in the community and levels of existing social capital. So just to summarize what I do find evidence of an income effect in that higher prices induce higher sales value and a higher farming income. I do find evidence that actually the effect of prices on the share of title land is higher for crops that are more valuable, like tree crops and cash crops. I do find as well, however, that perceived insecurity increases the share of titled land and that higher prices of tree and cash crops increase perceived insecurity. Getting to the social context, instead, I find that higher social capital, which I proxy by a higher degree of ethnic homogeneity in the community, increases certain types of land registration but reduces others, but that the latter effect is due to a reduction in perceived insecurity caused by a higher social capital. Turning to social constraints, I run a bunch of heterogeneity analysis focusing on different groups in the society that might be either more vulnerable or more privileged. For example, households whose head is a woman, or ethnic minorities, wealthier households, or households connected to local politicians. But I do not find a particularly different impact of prices on these subgroups. However, differences become stronger and statistically significant when I interact these with local social capital. So in areas where social capital is higher, marginalized groups benefit more and privileged groups benefit less, and vice versa for areas with lower social capital. So to wrap up and conclude, my paper finds that increases in prices of agricultural commodities make farmers increase their share of title land, but I am silent about the actual channels that we are considering. If you just consider my outcome and considering a share, so an increase in the share might be due either to an increase in the numerator or to a decrease in the denominator, or if anything, to an acquisition of title per se on existing land. However, be it as it may, what I'm showing here is that farmers seem to value title land as such. Whether this is a good thing depends on the specific mechanisms that we are considering here. If we are considering the income effect for which I'm showing evidence, this is surely a good thing, because it means that farmers are able to keep the land that they always wanted to have titled and were previously unable to have. But if we consider the effect of prices on higher insecurity, this is surely something that policymakers might want to think about. So what the main message of my paper is that the intensification of formal landholding following an increase in prices can surely be a driver of higher productivity, better opportunities, and eventually economic growth for a country, but it may also mask exacerbated tensions and inequality in the society, especially in a context where social capital is low. So, open questions for future research is whether actually titles are effective in boosting both agricultural performance and a better security of tenure for farmers, and in actually preventing land grabbing, of which farmers seem to be actually very concerned. And actually another question is whether an efficient system of property rights is in place and actually available to all. But with this, I think I can conclude, and I'm happy to discuss further.
Okay, thank you very much for the nice discussion. I tried to read this paper on crop price and demand for titled land, evidence from Uganda. The paper, I found it very interesting and with a broad dimension, and that it contributes to the literature on land certification and property rights by analyzing how agricultural prices, poor land registration and land market activity, which is the main asset of production by smallholder farming in Uganda as well as in similar African countries. In this regard, I found the paper very interesting. In addition, I have also some few concerns or things that I may not be clear on this paper. For instance, the paper has a limitation by aggregating the effect of agricultural price on the demand of certification without disaggregating households as net producers versus consumers. So it would have been very interesting to show the value of land and the demand for certification if the paper was based on the disaggregated data, net producers versus consumers, because its implication is different for net producers, surplus producers, or deficit producers of households. So it would be interesting and make it complete or make generalization if you can do like that. And again, inside the paper focused on private disputes as an indicator of tenure insecurity to analyze its correlation to land certification, while actually there are also other tenure insecurity indicators such as government exploration of land, border dispute experience before land distribution, and such as population pressure also allowed, where you can get secondary data about population density in the local area, which can be also a source of tenure insecurity, and that could also lead to higher price for agricultural commodities, because more population density means more demand for agricultural commodities. More demand for agricultural commodities means more value for land and higher agricultural output. So it would be interesting if you try to incorporate this source of or indicators of insecurity so as to come up with a complete picture of your analysis. I also suggest, of course, you try to analyze the demand for land certification using tree plants versus cash crops and so on. It would be fine if you can also try to add some interesting about biofuel. Nowadays, the issue of biofuel is expanding. So biofuel, instead of focusing only on the price of cash and crop vis-a-vis the demand for land certification, it would have been interesting to incorporate the price of biofuels, which may offer an opportunity for poor farmers, which are traditionally squeezed by low agricultural price, to get better terms of trade, which in turn raises the value of land and the demand for more certification. So given Uganda and other East African countries are involved in the expansion of this biofuel, it would be interesting, because I believe that more than this cash crop and tree crops, the biofuel would demand more land and give higher value to land. So it's better if you could see its implication for the demand for land certification. Thank you very much.
Why don't I respond to this and then I take a few more questions? So, well, on the net producers versus net consumers, you actually cheated because I wrote it down in the limitation section. So I'm very aware of that. Yeah, and it's something that I'm trying to assess, to find a way around. But yeah, I'm definitely very aware of this limitation. On the insecurity of tenure indicators, thank you very much for the suggestions. Actually, if you could then send me your slides, I would be very interested in having them. Although I will surely explore this avenue, but what I am focusing here is on the individual incentives faced by the Ugandan farmers. So whether, I mean, what I was interested was whether they were concerned or not, like in any case, so whether they felt insecure or not, regardless of the mechanisms behind that, whether it was for land appreciation per se or government land exploring. Oh, thanks. Government land exploring, or the other channels that you suggest. But that's surely a very interesting addition to the paper to have it more complete. On biofuels, it's really interesting that you mentioned that because it's actually a plan for another paper that I want to write. But actually, I wanted to write it on a totally different setting in Guatemala. So it's nice to see that I can also use my expertise on Uganda to write a paper on that as well. So thank you very much for the suggestion.
Hi, thank you very much. That was super interesting. This may already be incorporated in what you've done, but I was wondering about administrative quality for land titling, thinking that if there's increased prices, there'll be more demand for land titling, so the quality of the administration of land titles will be increased. So those two things may both be correlated. So whether maybe that's already incorporated, but I wanted your thoughts on that.
Hi, Vivi. Quick question. What would you say are the main policy implication of the work here? Would you say easier access to land property rights or less?
All right.
Or neither?
Okay, I'll just get back. So on your point, yeah, actually that's something I haven't done yet, but I definitely have data on that. So it's just a very good suggestion, and I have like self-reported information on quality. So I was not particularly and it's like very coarse. They just ask whether there's literally a question about, do you think this parcel of land is good quality or bad quality? So I'm not really sure, given that I cannot follow land over time. I'm not really sure how to fit that, but I can still maybe produce an indicator of like the amount of land that farmers consider good and interact that. So I can totally think about something along those lines, and that's actually very good suggestions. In terms of the policy implications, I think it's not. Well, first of all, let me say that now the land titling system has improved substantially. So I have actually I had a slide that showed the World Bank index of ease of registering property, and there's actually a spike in the indicator in recent years, like soon after my period of analysis, which is also why I think my analysis was good. Like, why I limited my analysis to that period, because later on it got much easier to register the land. But apart from that, I think the main policy implication is that the government should make sure that land grabbing doesn't happen, and so provide a more secure environment for farmers. For example, I was reading in the news like a few days ago that there was this case in which the government was subsidizing a multinational corporation that was doing actually very valuable work, because they were reforesting an area, and this would have been very good both for land preservation and soil reconstruction, and it was also like giving work to local work. But at the same time, to do so, they had displaced farmers that had been farming that land for generations, but that did not have a certificate of title on that land, so they had very easy time to do so. So in that respect, it's very difficult to assess who is in the right and what the most desirable outcome is. So I think this is the main takeaway of my paper.
Any other question? Hi, my name is Niklas Birhan, and so we're broadly going to stay with land registration and sort of land certificates, and I'm going to be talking about the impacts of a land title registration pilot intervention that was done in Ghana. This is, as is often the case, not only my work. It's a bunch of co-authors who are listed down there. One of them is here, Marcus, and this is actually going to be the only slide that I'm using to situate the study, and it's going to double as my motivation, and it's going to triple as the literature review. So not to go too much into this, but sort of there is a very large literature out there, both theoretically as well as sort of empirical, on the importance of property rights, on economic activities, and so this is well established. This is also well established when it comes to land holdings, and sort of there is a bunch of predictions that's coming out of these models that people have employed, but sort of to categorize them very broadly, you might want to think about, when it comes to land markets in particular, that giving people more secure property rights through land titles, that there will be gains from trade, so establishing land markets, land will be allocated more efficiently. You might also want to think about sort of people having or facing less expropriation risk, and that actually makes them to invest more into their land. And here you can think very broadly. So if people farm the land, these investments might look very, very different than sort of in more urban settings, where investment on land, for example, can take the form of building houses or structures. It's also often the case that secure property rights, in particular in land, rights facilitate access to credit. So that's because a lot of the financial institutions that are out there will require collateral in exchange for granting credit, and as is often the case, sort of land titles is seen as the most secure form of collateral, if not actually the only form of collateral that's being accepted by financial institutions. Now, the final sort of prediction that comes out of theory is that there will be sort of lower diversions of resources and a more efficient use of the land once people get higher tenure security. And the empirical evidence on land title interventions in Africa in particular is still developing, is very much developing, but is also a little bit mixed at the moment, with probably the strongest support sort of on the investment, on the impacts of investment. And sort of what's also being discussed as being highly relevant and important here is that you want to look at gender differentiated impacts and effects of land titling interventions, simply due to the fact that there's sort of traditionally there's a lot of inequalities and inefficiencies even within households, and so that you might want to expect that the impacts of land titling are very different depending on whether the person owning the land is a man or a woman. So keeping these things in mind, what I'm going to be talking in particular is a land title pilot registration project that was carried out in Ghana. So Ghana for quite some time had sort of the regulatory framework to issue land titles. However, the rate, very much like in Uganda, was actually rather low, and sort of the government was thinking through ways how to speed up and sort of streamline this process. So there was this pilot intervention, which again didn't really change the regulatory framework, but it actually was sort of more oriented on the process and made it easier and speeded up the process so that people could get land titles faster. Overall, the aim was to title 2,500 certificates or parcels in a specific sort of small-scale pilot location in Ghana, and the project made relative good progress. So 3 years after the initiation, around 60% of that target was reached. Now, in order to evaluate this project, what's very interesting in the way that the project was rolled out is that there is a road, roughly a circular road, and I'm going to show you a map in a second, that sort of demarcates the pilot intervention location. And so all the plots, all the land that was sort of encompassed by this road. Inside this road was part of the pilot, and all the land that was outside of the road was not made subject to this project. So what we are using is simply the road as a demarcation between the project area and surroundings for our treatment and our control group. And you can really think about, driving along the road and sort of everybody on the right is not actually allowed to title the land under this project, versus everybody on the left-hand side can title the land under this. So we're using a regression discontinuity design. This is how it actually looks like. The map isn't great. This is the area where this takes place. It's very close to our cross, so the urban setting is sort of coming there slowly but surely. And what you see, the shaded area here, that's the project side. We sampled households 200 meters to the left and to the right of the road. So the shaded area that's sort of outside this red demarcation, here's our treatment group. The non-shaded area that's within the green boundary here is what's our control group. There's also the blue boundary, which demarcates sort of a long-term control group that I'm not going to be talking about today, though. So the data collection was initiated in 2009. There were 3 waves of data collection, from which we established a household-level panel. The other waves took place in 2011 and 2014. As I said earlier, so all the households within a 200-meter boundary from the road were made subject to the data collection. Overall, we're capturing roughly 20 communities. And the data collection was very extensive, so it was a very long questionnaire. We also have GPS information on the household, as well as on the plots that they own. We started out with 2,450 households. The sample drops quite a bit, so we do face some more attrition than we would like. And I'm gonna later on get back to how we're trying to deal with this. Our estimation strategy is relatively straightforward. So what we are looking here is at ITT impacts mainly. So purely the impacts of sort of living within that area that allowed people to title their land. We're looking here at all 3 waves. So we create an interaction between the treatment dummy and the time dummy, and sort of this is going to give us, for each of the 3 waves, this is going to give us a project impact. And please remember, sort of the initiation of the project was in 2009. Our first data collection was in 2010, so we don't really have a baseline. But you have sort of the first 2 waves, which give you short-term impacts, versus the last wave, which sort of gives you longer-term impacts. We control for a bunch of household characteristics, the usual suspects. In addition, we also control for sort of population density, as well as the distance to the road that the household lives away from. And we also control for chiefdom dummies. So this is meant to sort of approximate the institutional setup in which these households operate and under which they actually can register their land. And then importantly, sort of wherever it's possible, we try to split up our regressions, so to run them on the household separately, but then also to run them for women and men separately, who have been interviewed both, in order to get at these gender differentiated impacts that I was talking about earlier. Now first, the project sort of was, as mentioned, or as sort of differently shown before, was relatively successful in reaching out to people. So from a very low mean in R1, again, which is already impacted by the project, sort of the titling increase 3-dimension, which is the plot demarcated, the land actually being measured, and then whether any of the land is being registered. The way that that you can read this table is sort of for each of these 3 columns, for R1, R2, R3, these are simply the coefficients on the interaction term. So here, time interacted with whether you live in the project pilot location. So the land titling actually took place, and sort of the first set of outcomes that we looked at, sort of what does it to land tenure. And as a matter of fact, you do see, if anything, people started getting rid of some of their land. In various forms and sort of, but there is an intensification of the land markets that happened, and this effect in particular seems to come from women. Now, at the same time, though, people, if anything, are less worried now to lose their land if they leave it empty, so if they don't use it. So in that sense, land tenure here really did have a positive impact. And people, if anything, also perceive that the land is now valued, especially in the very long run, in a fact that mainly comes from land that's being owned by men. Now, how does this translate into the ability of people to use this land as collateral? So again, if anything, we see an increase in sort of outstanding loans. This effect mainly seems to come from men, and it does materialize more in the long term. Now, having covered that, sort of the credit part, now what about investment? In particular, when it comes to sort of investments that you would see from farmers being done on agricultural land, there we actually don't see that much. If anything, land is less fallow, which in many ways is being seen as an investment on women's plots. We do see some investments on male plots when it comes to trees being planted in sort of the short term, and we do see that that overall, in particular, men in the short term build more structures on this land. Now, in terms of agricultural production, so here it's important to keep in mind that the literature sort of predicts that a lot of that the resources are being used more efficiently. And efficiently in many ways, and in particular when it comes to farming, might actually mean that you cut out labor that's not necessarily necessary. You can think about things like having to guard your land in the off season. So when you're not growing, you want to prevent your neighbor from sort of slowly but surely taking more and more of your land and sort of crouching on your land, that people have to guard their land. And so we do see quite a bit of a reduction in hours spent on agricultural production in response to the land title registration. We do see a small reduction in the value of total agricultural production on women's plots. However, this is total agricultural production, and I showed you before that sort of some of the women seem to sell off their land or get rid of the land. So if you were to run these regressions on a per hectare basis, you actually see no reduction in agricultural productivity, and you do actually see an increase, so particularly an increase in the efficiency on male plots. Now, so to the last set of results here is that it seems that people, which is very much in line with them getting rid of some of their land, they do seem to go off farm. This is true for both women as well as men. So households in the pilot location, they do enjoy higher profits from non-farm enterprises, especially in the long run. There is a bunch of robustness checks that we are doing here. So I'm not going to go in particular depth here, but we're thinking, the institutional setting obviously matters a lot. Our preferred specification is to sort of take chiefdoms into account, but we do have other specifications where we use village fixed effects to sort of control for that institutional setting. We're very much concerned about the attrition, so we are estimating a specification that corrects for the inverse probability, or that does take the inverse probability weighting into account, and that way tries to correct for the attrition. We're also very much concerned, and that came up earlier, about the spatial correlation, and sort of there are two ways how we can think about this. Like, one is an autoregressive regression where the outcomes of your neighbors sort of influence your outcomes, so we are estimating an SAR there. There's another sort of concern that there might be omitted variables that are important in the local context, and so we're using a spatial fixed effect. So basically where sort of the context is specified for each individual household, and you differentiate out the dependent variable from your neighbors. And we are also estimating so it's a local average treatment effect using an IV approach, where we simply use the treatment assignment, whether you're in or outside of the pilot location as an IV. But given that this is sort of a binary IV, it's relatively less interesting because there's not much movement. You can sort of almost compute these estimates from the OLS results. So taken together, sort of the land title pilot project was quite successful in reaching the target group. It does raise the perceived land tenure, and it facilitated a little bit more access to credit, as sort of theory would predict and as one would hope. And it appears that it has led the project beneficiaries to go off farm and sort of to get rid of some of the land. There are considerable differences, though, how women and men sort of respond differentially to this intervention, and so I think that'll be one of our key emphasis on how to work more on that going forward. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's still very much work in progress, so we're really looking forward to improving this paper, and your comments, I'm sure, will help with that. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for the very interesting presentation. Well, I'm not going to summarize the paper, but I can just say that I really enjoyed reading it, especially because it's like a very good complement to my paper, I think. So I wonder whether they did it on purpose or not, but it was I think it's a very relevant research question for sure. I like the fact that you really were able to exploit a need identification strategy, and that you really provided a very comprehensive set of outcomes on which you focus. So it's nice to have a bigger picture. And well, it's also, I was very interested in the asymmetries that you documented along gender lines. I think, as you have just mentioned, it's a very interesting finding of yours. I have a few questions. First of all, I think what I was really missing in the paper as it is right now, I'm sympathetic that it is very work in progress, but there is no discussion of the results, and there are no suggested mechanisms. Whereas I think that, especially given what you find, I think it would be nice if you could provide a little bit of more intuition of what might be going on there, especially as regards the short versus the long run results, which sometimes do not really go in the expected way. Sometimes you do find an effect in the short run, but then vanishes in the long run, and vice versa, or then sometimes the effect is actually reversed. I'm talking about the version of the paper that I read, but I think this might be true for this new set of results here as well. So I think it would be very interesting to see a little bit more what is going on here, especially for what concerns women and credit access. I am not totally sure that what you're finding is an increased access to credit, but again, I would have to read through the new version of the paper, but you had a decrease in the outstanding loan, if I remember correctly, but without no increase in the likelihood of having a new loan. So I'm not really sure how to interpret this finding without further elaborating on them. And then, yeah, same goes for savings. And for men, I was a bit puzzled by their self-reported evaluation of land, which seemed to go pretty much down in the very short run, then to increase in the long run. But it would be interesting to see why they might be thinking that the value of their land goes down after titling it. And also, in terms of land acquisition, you found that actually they were more likely to increase their share of land that was acquired through, I think, bequests and informal acquisitions. So I think why are they more likely to go informal after the land titling program? I think it's interesting to see what might be going on there. And then, yeah, couple minor comments about it would be nice to have in the paper a little bit more detail about the intervention per se, and then you also motivate among your contribution to the literature. You mentioned that you're actually focusing on an area that is particular because it features the competition among alternative land uses, but you don't really use this fact in the paper, whereas I think it's really interesting. It would be interesting to see how that interacts with your findings. And then on a few thoughts on methodology. First of all, you haven't talked about this today, but I think the long-run control group, for that you're using a control group, houses are located further away from the 200 meters belt. And I'm not really sure that the parallel trend assumption would hold in that respect, because being further away from a road might actually have some effects that are just not those of not being exposed to the policy. So I would think about it a little bit more carefully. Then I think you have here scope for an interesting IV identification strategy for your ATT. You don't really need to focus on the ITT. At least, so you have a very, very strong first stage in that you see that the intervention causes land certification. So that would be your first stage, and then you could use that as to then estimate the impacts on, for example, credit access or value of land, or all your other outcomes. I mean, the reduced form estimates seem promising, so you might want to think about that. I think you're being too modest here, and I think you could do a bit more. And then attrition you've already discussed it. And then I think before talking about differences along gender lines, you may really want to have a test for equality of the coefficients. I haven't seen that in the paper. I don't know if it's there in the new version, but you may just want to introduce an interaction with of the land titling program with the gender dummy, just to make any potential referee happy with that. And same goes for multiple hypothesis testing. You have a bunch of outcomes. You should provide, I think, like a Q value or something, just for referees to be happy with your results. But apart from that, I really think it was a very interesting presentation and paper. So I would encourage you to go on with it, because it's really nice. Thank you.
Maybe I'm just going to try to sort of quickly respond to that. I think this is what you get when you present early results. You get a lot of suggestions, and they're all good, and they're I think mostly true, and sort of things that were concerning us as well. I'm going to try to just get maybe into a few of them, maybe not all of them. So I think one of the main thing is sort of in the mechanisms. So from the literature, there are a few of these predictions that we can sort of find already in the data that seems to be supported in our findings. And I agree that there's certainly more that we can do on the mechanisms, especially because there is quite a bit of literature, and there might be some other testable predictions. And so this is certainly something that we want to do going forward. You mentioned the valuation of land, and that this is perhaps not an extremely strong result, and I couldn't agree more. So this is self-evaluated. We actually did try to sort of measure the land valuation on a more objective basis for a subsample of the plots that we have. It's been quite challenging to reconcile some of the data from this exercise with the kind of data on the self-reports. So this is something that we might want to deal with if we can in the future. More on the project and sort of the description of what the project did. Well taken. You mentioned that we're not using the long-term control group, and that perhaps this is actually a good thing. In the current version, because them living further away from the road perhaps are not as comparable to sort of the people living very close to the road and perhaps having more market access. I would totally agree with that, and so that's why in all these estimates we actually excluded the long-term control group. So it was thought that perhaps this control group would be useful as the project sort of expands in its area. It wasn't really applicable for the time span that we have, and so for now we're focusing on the short-term control. We might do something with the long-term control, but for now we're sort of happy with what we have. You mentioned that we should show perhaps the ATT and that there is something that we can do. As I mentioned, I think we didn't want to focus too much on it because it's sort of, it would be a binary instrument, and with that sort of, you take the inverse of whatever percentage of people that have been titled, and you can sort of multiply your ITT estimates with that. So in that sense, it's for us, it was less of interest, but surely we've estimated those, and we might include them in a later version of the tables. And the same is absolutely true for sort of showing or for testing for equality the male and the female coefficients, just to make sure that we're not sort of hanging too much or clinging on too much on one star or the other. So on that. Are there any other questions? Yes? I think that's always the case with the last session. No, like it's enough. Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
you for the great presentation. I really liked it, and I wanted to see, like, when Viviana presented her results, for the customary, there was no changes. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay. In your case, I don't know if there was customary, but you have like chiefship in Ghana.
Yeah.
And maybe I might be wrong with that, but it's kind of like some kind of customary also, because the king controls land in the village. So I know you include village fixed effect, which will capture that, but I want to know if, like in the descriptive, you are able to exploit that, to see if there is any difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there any other question? All right. I'm going to focus on that one then. Yeah. No. So the chief, the customary system is very much. It's just like you described in Ghana. So it is very much true that the vast majority of the land is sort of is family or stool land, and so this is what we're facing in this particular setting as well. And what you're registering is also a freehold. So it somewhat remains. We actually are not as granular, so we can sort of precisely pinpoint like what kind of right we are registering. So this is sort of why we broadly, stick to registered, and that's at the same time why we want to control for chiefdoms, because they have a lot of sort of freedom and how they make this work in their particular areas. So how they organize it, how they institutionalize who gets to use which land, and so we think if you want to compare that, for example, with sort of the village market economy, something that we could have taken as well as sort of the main institutional, the main institution that would matter in this case. We think that actually, especially when it comes to land, sort of that's, the chief sets that. And so we wanted to control for that, the institutional setting that's present due to the sheets. Yeah. The questionnaire is like that big, so I could imagine that we're having some information on that. At the same time, I also think that we tried to look at social connections at some point, and surely we had no sort of impacts on that. I don't think that we've looked at it as sort of a mediating or, as a sort of heterogeneity yet. This might be something to come, but we've not looked at that yet. All right. Yeah, no, that's certainly something that that would be of interest.
Can I also ask a final question?
Absolutely.
Do you have any information on the cost of the project? I mean, this was a pilot, and I mean, apparently it seemed to be working. Do you think it's like foreseeable that the government might replicate it on a larger scale, and whether it would be easy to do? Or
So the pilot was very much initiated sort of as something to inform later projects, and at the point of sort of the per parcel cost that was estimated was around $165. So for every registered parcel of land, which I believe sort of is rather on the high side. So it's not a very cheap intervention at the same time, as sort of pilots tend to be. And again, I mean, this might be something that we'll do in the future, but given these kind of cost estimates, it would also be extremely interesting to sort of see what the gains, in particular, when you look at households going off farm, like how long it would actually take. Also for households, if that was the market price to pay for this.
sure.
Yeah. All right. Should we? I think we can close the session then 10 minutes early. So that's great. Thank you so much.